Ethan had lived alone on his ranch for many years. His land stretched far into the dry fields, where the wind carried dust across the open ground, and the sun painted everything in gold. He had no family left, and the closest town was several miles away. Most days, he worked from sunrise until evening, fixing fences, feeding horses, and tending to cattle. His life was quiet, almost too quiet at times, and the silence of the ranch often wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. Still, it was the life he knew, and he stayed busy enough to fill the long days. One hot afternoon, when the sun was high and the air shimmered over the dusty ground, Ethan heard horses approaching. He was near the barn, repairing a broken plank, when he looked up and saw a small group of settlers riding toward his ranch. Their faces were serious, and their clothes were covered in dust from travel. Ethan wiped his hands on his shirt and stepped forward, wondering what brought them here. Visitors were rare, especially unannounced ones. The men stopped their horses a short distance from him. Their leader, a tall man with a thick beard, dismounted first. Ethan recognized them. They were the same men he had helped several months ago during a harsh winter. Their wagon had broken down near his land, and he had given them food and tools so they could return safely to town. They had promised to repay him someday, but Ethan had not thought much about it. He had helped them because it felt right, not because he expected anything in return. "Afternoon," Ethan said, trying to keep his tone calm as he approached. "Didn't expect to see you folks again." The bearded man nodded. "We came to settle our debt." Ethan gave a small shrug. "There's no debt to settle. You needed help. I gave it." But the men exchanged uneasy glances. Their horses shifted anxiously, as if they sensed something tense in the air. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Something wasn't right. The bearded man cleared his throat, then motioned to the last rider. That rider stepped forward, holding a rope in his hand. At the other end of the rope stood a young Apache woman. Her wrists were tied, her feet dirty from walking, and her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders. Her face looked tired, but her eyes were steady and alert. "This is your payment," the bearded man said. "We caught her after an attack near the river. Thought you could use some help around your ranch." Ethan froze. For a moment, he thought he had misheard them. He stared at the woman. She stood tall even with her hands bound, and she didn't lower her gaze. Ethan turned back to the men, his jaw tight. "This isn't payment," he said sharply. "And I don't want this." One of the men frowned. "She's wild, dangerous. Better she serves someone than causes more trouble." Ethan felt anger rise in him. He didn't shout, but his voice turned firm. "Untie her." The men looked confused. "You don't want her?" "I said untie her," Ethan repeated, stepping closer. He wasn't a man who liked conflict, but he also wasn't a man who accepted cruelty. The bearded man sighed, shrugged, and nodded. The rope was loosened, and the young woman rubbed her wrists gently where the ropes had left marks. "You're making a mistake," one of the settlers muttered. "If her people come looking for her, they won't ask questions." Ethan looked at the woman again. She didn't show fear, but she looked exhausted, like she had traveled far with little rest. He turned back to the settlers. "You shouldn't have taken her," Ethan said quietly. Without arguing further, the men mounted their horses again. As they rode away, dust rose behind them until they disappeared beyond the horizon. Ethan stood there for a long moment, watching them go. Then he turned toward the woman. She didn't step back or run. She just waited, her eyes steady on him, as if trying to understand what kind of man he was. "Are you hurt?" Ethan asked softly. She didn't understand his words, but she watched his hands as he gestured gently, pointing at her wrists and then at her feet. She shook her head slowly. She wasn't badly hurt, only tired, thirsty, and worn down from the journey. Ethan walked toward the water barrel near the barn and filled a cup. He placed it on the ground halfway between them. He stepped back so she could approach without fear. The woman looked at him, then slowly walked forward. She picked up the cup with both hands and drank carefully, as if she didn't want to waste a drop. When she finished, she placed the cup back in the exact spot and stepped away. Ethan nodded softly. "You're welcome." Luff. He wasn't sure what to do next. He didn't want to force her to stay, but he also didn't want to leave her alone in the open plains with no food or shelter. She didn't move away from the ranch. Instead, she stood by the barn, her eyes studying everything around her. The land, the house, the sky. There was a quiet strength in her presence, something that felt older than words. Ethan walked toward the house and gestured for her to follow. She hesitated, but then walked after him, keeping a few steps behind. When they reached the porch, Ethan opened the door and pointed inside. He offered her a seat and then prepared a simple meal: bread, beans, and water. He placed the plate before her and stepped back again, giving her space. She ate slowly, carefully, as if she didn't want to seem greedy. After she finished, Ethan brought her a blanket. She looked at it with surprise. No one who captured her had ever handed her something with kindness. She touched the fabric lightly, then held it close. Nightfall came quietly. The crickets began their nightly song, and the cool breeze washed over the ranch. Ethan made a small bed for her near the corner of the main room, far from the door so she could feel safe. He didn't lock anything. He didn't tie her. He simply trusted that she would stay because she wished to, not because she was forced. Before lying down, she looked at Ethan with a calm, steady gaze. In her eyes, he saw confusion, but also a spark of something softer. Perhaps relief. Perhaps curiosity. Ethan nodded once, letting her know she was safe for the night. She lay down quietly, pulling the blanket around her. Ethan sat at his small wooden table long after she fell asleep. He felt troubled, not by her presence, but by the situation. He didn't understand her language, and she didn't understand his. But kindness didn't need many words. He wondered what she had been through, where her family was, and how he could help her return home safely. He picked up a pencil and wrote a letter to the local authorities, explaining what had happened and asking for guidance. He knew it might take days, even weeks, to get a reply. Still, he had to try. He didn't want to make a wrong decision. When he finally went to sleep, the ranch was silent except for the soft sound of the horses in the barn. The young woman slept peacefully for the first time in many days. Ethan lay awake for a while, thinking about how quickly his quiet life had changed. He didn't know her story yet, and he didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But he knew one thing: she was not a slave, and he would not allow anyone to treat her as one again. The night passed slowly, and dawn was only a few hours away, but the ranch already felt different. Ethan had no idea that the woman sleeping in his home was far more important than anyone had told him. He didn't know she was the daughter of a chief. All he knew was that she was someone who deserved dignity, safety, and respect. And in that moment, as he drifted into sleep, he silently promised himself he would do everything he could to make sure she found her way back to the life that was taken from her. The morning light slowly filled Ethan's ranch house, brushing the wooden walls with a soft golden glow. Ethan woke early, like he always did. He sat up and glanced toward the corner where the young Apache woman slept. She lay curled in the blanket he had given her, breathing quietly, her face calm in the morning light. It was the first peaceful sleep she had likely had in a long time. Ethan didn't want to wake her, so he quietly stepped outside to start his chores. The air was cool, and the sky stretched wide with soft colors. Ethan walked to the barn, fed the horses, checked the water troughs, and began preparing the day's tasks. His mind kept drifting back to the woman in his house. He still didn't know her name, and he didn't know how much she understood. But he felt a sense of responsibility for her. She was alone, far from her people, and the world outside the ranch could be dangerous for someone in her situation. After some time, he heard gentle footsteps behind him. When he looked toward the barn door, the woman stood there, wrapped in the blanket, her dark hair falling over her shoulders. She had woken on her own and followed the sound of his work. Ethan gave her a small nod, hoping to show she was welcome outside. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped fully into the barn. The horses shifted, their ears twitching with curiosity. The woman moved slowly, carefully, her eyes studying every detail around her. Ethan could see she wasn't afraid, just cautious. He pointed to one of the buckets, then pointed to the horse stalls, trying to ask if she wanted to help. She watched him for a moment, then nodded. She walked with steady steps and began filling the buckets. She handled the tools gently, as if she already knew their purpose. Ethan noticed she worked quietly, without needing instructions repeated. Her movements were calm and efficient, showing she had experience with hard work. After finishing the water, she brushed one of the horses. She used slow, soft strokes, and the horse relaxed under her hand. Ethan watched silently, impressed. Horses did not trust just anyone, especially strangers. But this woman seemed to understand animals in a natural way. She bent slightly and whispered something in her own language to the horse. The horse snorted lightly, almost as if responding. Ethan smiled a little. "You're good with them," he said softly, even though he knew she didn't understand the words. Still, she looked at his face and seemed to sense his meaning. She nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement. Later, they walked back toward the house together. Ethan cooked a simple breakfast, eggs and bread, and placed a plate for her. She watched every step he made, as if trying to learn his routines. She ate quietly, but with more ease than the night before. After breakfast, she stood and gently touched her chest, then touched her forehead, then the table. She seemed to be trying to thank him in her own way. Ethan nodded. "You're welcome," he said, placing his hand over his heart in a simple gesture. Her expression softened, and for the first time, she gave him a faint smile. It lasted only a moment, but it told Ethan she was beginning to trust him. The day passed with a strange but peaceful rhythm. They didn't share a language, yet they communicated through gestures, simple signs, and small actions. Ethan showed her how to repair a fence post, and she watched carefully before helping him hammer the nails. When he carried heavy supplies, she carried smaller ones beside him. Their teamwork grew naturally, without any force or expectation. Later in the afternoon, she went outside alone, walking a slow circle around the ranch. Ethan watched from a distance, not wanting to intrude. She seemed to be studying the land, memorizing its shape, sensing its direction. Sometimes, she knelt to touch the soil, or picked up small plants. She knew how to read nature like a book, and Ethan realized she was more skilled than he had imagined. When she returned, she brought him a handful of herbs, small green leaves with a sharp, fresh smell. She placed them on the table and pointed to a cut on his hand he had gotten earlier while fixing the fence. She motioned for him to sit. Ethan hesitated, but he trusted her. She gently took his hand and pressed the herbs onto the cut. The coolness stung for a moment, then soothed. She wrapped the herbs with a small piece of cloth. Ethan was surprised. She knew how to heal using plants from the land. He looked at her with gratitude. She nodded once and stepped back. As the sun began to set, they worked together to gather firewood. The sky turned orange and pink, and the air grew cooler. They carried logs to the small fire pit behind the house. Ethan struck a match and started the fire, while she arranged the logs in a careful pattern that made the flames burn brighter and steadier. They sat near the fire, not too close, but not far apart either. The crackling flames made the quiet more comfortable. Ethan took a small stick and drew a simple outline of the ranch in the dirt. He pointed to the barn, the house, and the fence, naming each one slowly. She watched closely, then touched the drawing and repeated some of the sounds he made. Her voice was soft, almost delicate. Ethan smiled. She was trying to learn his language. Then she took the stick from him gently and drew her own picture. She drew mountains, then lines that looked like rivers, and small circles representing people. She pointed to one of the circles and then to herself. Ethan realized she was drawing her village, her people, her home. Her eyes softened with memory, but there was a shadow of sadness there too. She missed them. She wanted to return. Ethan nodded slowly, showing he understood. He pointed to the mountains in her drawing, then pointed to the north, where distant peaks lined the horizon. She looked in that direction, her expression filled with both hope and longing. Then she placed her hand over her heart. She was telling him something important. Her heart belonged back there. Ethan wished he could take her home right away. But he didn't know how to do it safely. He didn't know where her people were now, or if they were searching for her. He worried that going alone into Apache territory could put both of them in danger. He had written to the authorities, but he didn't know how long it would take for a reply. Still, he silently promised himself he would find a way. As the night deepened, they returned to the house. Ethan fixed a space for her near the bed, but this time she sat for a long moment before lying down. She watched the door, then the windows, as if making sure she understood the house well. She wasn't afraid, just cautious, like someone who had survived difficult moments and learned to stay alert. Ethan sat at his table again, writing another note just in case his first letter didn't reach anyone. He tried to keep his thoughts calm, but he felt a growing sense of responsibility toward her. She wasn't a burden, and she wasn't someone he could simply ignore. She was someone who had been taken from her home, someone who had lost her freedom without cause. And now she stood in his life, changing everything without speaking many words. Before sleeping, Ethan looked at her once more. She was resting with her eyes closed, her breathing steady. Even in silence, she brought a different warmth to the house, a presence that softened the loneliness he had carried for years. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he would treat her with respect and protect her as best as he could. Outside, the moon rose high above the fields, lighting the quiet land. The ranch stood peaceful, with two people from different worlds slowly learning to trust each other. The lonely rancher and the displaced Apache woman shared the same roof, sharing small moments of understanding that needed no words. Bit by bit, the walls of silence between them were beginning to fall, and neither of them knew that far away, deep in the mountains, a worried Apache chief was searching for his missing daughter. The following days passed quietly on the ranch, but a storm was slowly building outside their small world. Ethan felt it long before he saw any trouble. There was a heaviness in the air, a feeling that someone was watching or whispering about things they shouldn't. He noticed how riders passed the ranch more often than usual. He noticed how people from town looked strangely at him when he went to buy supplies. Something had changed, and he didn't like it. Inside the ranch, life had become calmer, almost peaceful. The young Apache woman, who still had not shared her name, worked alongside Ethan with steady hands and silent strength. She helped with the horses, repaired fences, brought herbs and roots from the hills, and even learned a few simple English words. Ethan learned a few of her signs, too. They still didn't share a language fully, but their actions filled the gaps. One morning, she brought him a small bundle of wildflowers. She placed them on the table without saying a word, then walked away with a shy expression. Ethan smiled softly, touched by the simple gesture. He didn't know what the flowers meant in her culture, but he knew they weren't something she gave lightly. But their quiet world didn't stay quiet for long. One afternoon, Ethan heard horses riding hard toward the ranch. He walked outside quickly, his calm expression slipping into caution. 3 men from town stopped their horses near his fence. They didn't greet him. They didn't smile. Their faces carried suspicion and something darker. The tallest man, wearing a worn hat and a gun belt, stepped forward. Ethan kept his voice steady. "What things?" The man pointed toward the house. "That Apache girl. People say you've got her living here. That true?" Ethan didn't like the tone. He didn't like the way the man's hand rested on his belt like a threat. "She's not a girl. She's a woman. And she's not mine. She's staying here because she has nowhere else to go." The men exchanged glances. One of them spat on the ground. "You're keeping an Apache woman on your ranch like that?" "Folks think that's dangerous, Ethan. Her tribe's been restless. If they find out she's here, they'll come for you first." Ethan stood straighter. "She wasn't captured by me. She was brought here without her consent. I'm giving her shelter, not chains." The men didn't like his answer. Their faces hardened. "We're telling you to hand her over," the tall man said. "Town council doesn't like the idea of her staying here. They want her gone." "Well," Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Gone? Where?" "Doesn't matter," the man replied. "Just away from here." Before Ethan could answer, the sound of footsteps came from behind him. The Apache woman stepped out of the house. She didn't hide. She didn't show fear. She simply stood beside the doorway, her eyes calm but alert. She looked at the men, then at Ethan. One of the men smirked. "Look at that. She understands enough to come out when called." Ethan shook his head. "She's not coming out because of you." The tall man leaned forward on his horse. "You don't understand, Ethan. Her people don't like their women being held by settlers. They'll think you captured her. They might come in the night, burn your ranch, kill your cattle, and take whatever they want." Ethan felt anger rising. "She is not a slave. She is not property. You will not take her." The men stared at him with disbelief. The tall man finally scoffed. "Then you're a fool, Ethan, and fools don't last long out here." They turned their horses and rode off, leaving dust swirling behind them. When they were gone, Ethan let out a long breath. He didn't want trouble, but trouble had clearly found him. He turned to the woman. She was watching him closely, reading his face. Slowly, she pointed to the mountains far in the distance, then touched her heart. Ethan understood. She was telling him again she belonged with her people. Ethan nodded. "I know," he said softly. "But I need to find a way to do it safely." She lowered her gaze slightly, as if unsure. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out her hand toward his chest, lightly touched his shirt above his heart, and shook her head. She was saying no. She didn't want him to risk himself. That night, the ranch felt heavier. Shadows seemed deeper. Ethan locked the doors not because he feared her, but because he feared what the world outside might bring. The woman sat near the fire, staring at the flames with a distant expression. Ethan could see something troubling her, something she had been holding back. She suddenly stood, walked to the table, and took Ethan's pencil. She drew quickly, but carefully on a piece of paper. Ethan leaned closer. Curious. She drew a large circle for a village, then smaller circles around it. She pointed to one of them, then to herself. She drew a symbol above her figure. A feather, simple but clear. Ethan frowned, unsure what it meant. She took the pencil again and drew a tall man beside her, wearing the same feather symbol. Then she tapped her chest and tapped the drawing of the man. Understanding hit Ethan slowly but strongly. She wasn't just anyone from her tribe. She was the daughter of the Apache chief. Ethan stared at the drawing for a long moment. It explained her strength. It explained her calmness, her careful behavior, her quiet pride. It also meant her people were not simply searching for a missing woman, they were searching for someone important, someone precious, someone whose absence might cause anger or war. She stepped back, watching his reaction. Ethan placed a hand on his forehead, taking in the weight of what he had learned. No wonder the men from town were afraid. They didn't know the truth, but they sensed danger. Ethan looked at her gently. "You're the chief's daughter," he said softly, more to himself than to her. She nodded once, her expression serious. Suddenly she walked to the door. Ethan stood quickly. "Where are you going?" She didn't understand his words, but she understood his worry. She pointed to her chest, then pointed outside. She was trying to leave to protect him. She didn't want her presence to bring danger to his ranch. She didn't want anyone to hurt him because of her. Ethan shook his head firmly. "No, not like this. You won't walk out alone." She hesitated, confused. He stepped closer, slowly so she wouldn't feel threatened. He pointed to her, then to himself, then made a gesture of covering, as if protecting. She understood. He was telling her he wanted to help, not abandon her. Her eyes softened with something like relief. She stepped back inside and closed the door quietly. Later that night, as she slept, Ethan sat at his table with a candle burning low. He thought of the men who had come earlier, of their threats, of the danger approaching. He thought of the young woman sleeping under his roof, her story far more complicated than he had known. He promised himself he would not let anyone harm her, but he also knew he could not keep her hidden forever. Her people were coming. Whether they came with peace or anger depended on what they believed had happened to her. Ethan looked at the mountains again, the direction of her home. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to find a way to return her safely. Her story was no longer just hers. It had become part of his. And out there, beyond the quiet hills, the Apache search party was already closing in. The next morning arrived with a strange stillness. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the wind itself was warning Ethan that something important was coming. He woke early, but the Apache woman was already awake. She stood outside the house, staring at the mountains far in the distance. Her hair flowed gently in the morning breeze, and there was a quiet strength in her stance. She seemed to feel the same tension he felt, as though she knew her people were near. Ethan walked out and joined her. She looked at him, then pointed toward the hills again. Her eyes were sharp, listening to something he couldn't hear. Ethan knew people who grew up close to nature, had senses sharper than most settlers. She could read the land in a way he never could. If she felt something was approaching, he believed her. He stepped back into the house and checked the rifle hanging on the wall. He didn't plan to use it unless he had no choice. But danger had a way of arriving uninvited. He set it near the door, not hidden but not threatening. He didn't want to appear hostile to her people, but he also needed to protect her if things went wrong. The day passed slowly. Ethan fed the horses, checked the fences, and tried to keep his hands busy to quiet his thoughts. The woman helped silently, carrying water, gathering herbs, and preparing small tasks around the ranch. But every few minutes, she paused and looked toward the mountains, as if waiting for a signal. By late afternoon, the calm broke. The horses in the barn suddenly grew restless. They lifted their heads, ears twitching, hooves shifting nervously. The dog, usually calm, began to bark sharply, looking toward the fields. Ethan immediately felt alert. He stepped outside and scanned the horizon. Dust, riding dust. His heart jumped. He knew what that meant. The Apache woman saw it at the same time. But instead of fear, her expression changed into something calmer, something steady and brave. She walked to Ethan's side, standing tall despite the growing tension in the air. A group of Apache riders appeared from behind the distant hills. They moved fast, like shadows slipping across the land. They rode with purpose, not wandering, not uncertain. They knew where they were going, and they were heading straight for Ethan's ranch. Ethan stepped forward, raising both hands to show he meant no harm. The Apache woman did not hide behind him. She stood beside him, only a few steps back, her head high. The riders stopped several yards away. Their faces were sharp and serious. Their horses snorted, stamping the ground with impatience. These were warriors, alert, prepared, and deeply protective. One man at the front dismounted. He had long dark hair tied back, a scar across his cheek, and eyes that held both anger and worry. He looked from Ethan to the woman, then back to Ethan, with suspicion. He spoke in his language, his voice sharp but controlled. The woman stepped forward before Ethan could respond. She spoke quickly, her voice steady and filled with emotion. Ethan didn't understand her words, but he understood the tone. She was explaining what had happened. She was defending him. The warriors listened closely. Their tense expressions slowly shifted. Ethan could see their shoulders loosen a little. The woman continued speaking, pointing to Ethan, the ranch, the hills, and finally, the direction the settlers had taken her from. One of the younger warriors stepped off his horse, tears filling his eyes. He took the woman's hands gently. Ethan realized this must be someone close to her, a brother or childhood friend. She touched his face lightly, comforting him as he cried softly with relief. Still, the tension wasn't fully gone. The scarred warrior, the one who seemed to be leading them, stepped toward Ethan. He studied the rancher's face carefully, searching for any sign of deception or guilt. Ethan kept his expression calm. He made no sudden movements. Then Ethan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Another rider approached a man older than the rest, with silver in his hair and a tall, commanding presence. His face was lined with wisdom and grief. His eyes were dark and deep, carrying the weight of a leader who had suffered deeply in recent days. He was the chief. The Apache woman immediately dropped her gaze in respect, but the chief lifted her chin gently and touched her forehead with his. It was a simple, emotional gesture of love and relief. Ethan understood without words. This was a father who had found his missing daughter. The chief then turned to Ethan. His eyes held a strong, unreadable expression. He spoke slowly, his voice deep and powerful. Ethan didn't understand the words, but he felt their meaning: questions, concerns, and the need for truth. The woman stepped between them, her voice soft but firm. She explained everything again, pointing to the ropes the settlers had used, describing the journey, and showing with gestures how Ethan had treated her. She touched her wrist where the rope marks had once been, then pointed to Ethan's hands as if saying he had freed her. The chief listened quietly. His expression softened just slightly, but enough for Ethan to see a shift. After she finished speaking, the chief walked to Ethan. He placed a hand over his own heart, then touched Ethan's shoulder. It was a gesture of respect, gratitude, peace. Ethan exhaled slowly, relieved. The chief spoke again, this time softer. He pointed to his daughter, then to the mountains, then made a gesture of protection around her. Ethan nodded. He understood. She would be taken home now. But something happened that Ethan didn't expect. The woman stepped toward him. She lifted her hand slowly and placed it over her heart, then pointed to him with the same gentle motion she had made days earlier when thanking him. Her eyes held emotion, gratitude, respect, something deeper that neither of them had words for. The chief watched the exchange silently, his eyes thoughtful. The woman then stepped back toward her people. A warrior brought her a horse, and she climbed up gracefully. But even when her horse turned toward the mountains, she looked back at Ethan, her gaze holding a message he couldn't quite understand. But he felt it deeply. It wasn't goodbye. The Apache riders formed a protective circle around her. The chief lifted his hand once in farewell or perhaps acknowledgement. Then, with a swift command, the riders turned and galloped across the open land. their figures growing smaller as they blended into the horizon. The ranch fell silent again. Ethan stood there long after they had gone. The dust slowly settled around him. The wind carried the soft smell of sagebrush. The ranch felt strangely empty, though nothing had changed physically. He stepped back into the house. Her blanket was still neatly folded in the corner. The small herbs she gathered were still on the table. Her quiet presence lingered in every room. It was strange how someone he hardly knew had become such a part of his days. And now, the house felt too quiet again, too large, too empty. But he didn't feel regret. He felt something else, a sense of rightness. She was home, where she belonged. She had been returned to people who loved her, to the life that had been taken from her too suddenly. Still, as he looked toward the mountains, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end of their story. There had been something in her eyes, a silent promise. A bond formed under unexpected circumstances. Ethan didn't know it yet, but the chief had left with a decision in his heart, and the Apache woman had left carrying thoughts she couldn't forget. Something had begun on that ranch. Something that would soon bring the two worlds together again, in a way Ethan never imagined. The ranch felt strangely quiet in the days after the Apache riders left. Ethan returned to his usual chores, feeding horses, fixing fences, gathering firewood, but everything felt different now. The silence inside the house seemed heavier. Every time he walked past the corner where the Apache woman had slept, he felt an empty space in his chest. She had been in his life only for a short time, yet she had filled the long, lonely days with a new kind of warmth. He tried not to think about it too much. He told himself she was where she belonged, with her family, with her tribe, safe among people who loved her. That should have been enough. And, in some ways, it was. But he still found himself looking toward the mountains more often than before, wondering what she was doing, wondering if she remembered him at all. One afternoon, as Ethan rode into town for supplies, he noticed people watching him. They were simply curious, uncertain about what had happened. A few days back, word had spread that Apache warriors had been seen near Ethan's ranch. People whispered about the rancher who kept an Apache woman, and how he had somehow avoided what they assumed would be a violent confrontation. Ethan ignored the whispers. He kept to himself, collected what he needed, and returned home. He didn't owe anyone explanations, and he didn't care to start arguments with men who understood only rumors, not truth. A week passed, then another. Ethan tried to settle back into his old life, but he could not forget the look in her eyes before she left, the soft gratitude, the unspoken connection that didn't need words. He didn't expect to see her again. Life rarely returned what it took away. But one evening, everything changed. The sun had just dipped behind the hills, leaving the sky painted with deep colors. Ethan was closing the barn doors when he heard a distant sound. Horse hooves. Steady and deliberate. He frowned. Visitors didn't come at this hour. He stepped out into the yard and waited. 3 riders approached the ranch, moving calmly rather than aggressively. These were not townsmen. Their horses were decorated with simple Apache markings. Their posture was proud and respectful. Ethan's heart tightened with surprise. When they reached the ranch, the lead rider stepped down. He was a younger man. Ethan recognized one of the warriors who had ridden with the chief. The warrior placed his hand over his heart, then gestured toward Ethan in a respectful greeting. Ethan nodded, unsure of what was happening. The warrior spoke in his language, slow and clear, as if hoping Ethan might understand a few words. When he realized Ethan did not, he motioned toward the mountains, then pointed back toward Ethan. It was a simple message. Come with us. Ethan felt a mix of confusion and caution. Why were they here? Was there trouble? Did the chief want to speak to him? He had no reason to refuse, but he needed to know if he was safe. Sensing this, the warrior stepped forward and handed Ethan a small object. A carved piece of wood shaped like a hawk feather. Ethan recognized the symbol. It was the same one the Apache woman had drawn when revealing she was the chief's daughter. This was a sign of peace, a sign of invitation, a sign of trust. Ethan took the feather gently. He nodded, understanding the message. Without hesitation, he saddled his horse and followed the Apache riders toward the mountains. Their journey took hours. The land changed as they moved deeper into Apache territory. Tall pines, rocky paths, and narrow passes that only people familiar with the land could navigate. Ethan stayed alert, but calm. The riders were respectful, and he sensed no danger. They treated him as a guest, not an enemy. Finally, the small group reached a plateau overlooking a village hidden between the hills. Fires burned gently. People moved quietly. Children ran between lodges. And in the center, standing proudly, was the chief. The warriors led Ethan toward him. The chief stepped forward, his face thoughtful but welcoming. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, guiding him gently toward the center of the village. Ethan looked around, unsure what to expect. Then he saw her. The Apache woman stood near her father's lodge, dressed in simple traditional clothing, her hair braided neatly. She looked healthy, calm, and strong. When she saw Ethan, her eyes widened with a mixture of surprise and warmth. She stepped forward slowly, her expression softening with every step. Ethan felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight lifting off his chest. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the tiny spark in her eyes, the same spark that had appeared on the ranch whenever they shared a quiet moment. She touched her chest gently, then reached out and lightly touched his arm. It was the same gesture she had used before to thank him, but now it held something deeper: recognition, connection, gratitude that went beyond simple kindness. The chief spoke then, his voice steady and calm. He gestured toward Ethan, then toward his daughter, then toward the land around them. Although Ethan could not understand the exact words, he understood the intention. The chief was explaining something important. After the chief finished speaking, one of the younger warriors translated in simple English so Ethan would understand. "My chief says you cared for his daughter when she was alone," the warrior said. "He says you protected her and gave her respect. He says there are few men with such a heart." Ethan nodded quietly, humbled. The warrior continued. "He says his people owe you no debt. But if you ever need help, food, shelter, healing, you are welcome here. As a friend of the chief." Ethan felt a warmth spread through him. He had not expected a reward. He had not wanted one. But this gift, trust, respect, welcome meant more than anything material. The warrior then glanced at the chief's daughter, who stood silently beside Ethan. The warrior lowered his voice. "She asked the chief to invite you." Ethan turned to her slowly. She didn't look away. She held his gaze calmly, openly, letting him see what she could not say in words. She had missed him. She had thought of him. She had wanted him to come. They walked together through the village that evening. She showed him the river where she gathered water, the hill where she watched the sunrise, the herbal plants she used for healing. She didn't speak much, but her gestures carried meaning. She moved close to him, not out of need, but out of comfort. Ethan felt strangely at home. As the night deepened, the chief invited Ethan to sit beside the fire. The people shared food, stories, and soft music made from wooden flutes. The warmth of the fire flickered across the faces around him, and the chief's daughter sat quietly at his side. Ethan realized something then. Her time with him on the ranch had not been an accident. It had changed both of them. She had brought life back into his lonely days, and he had given her safety when she needed it most. Their worlds had collided in the harshest way, yet something gentle and meaningful had grown from it. When Ethan finally stood to leave the next morning, she walked with him to the edge of the village. She touched his arm again, slowly, like before. Then she pointed to the ranch direction, then to her heart, then back to him. The meaning was clear even without words. She would see him again. Ethan smiled softly, touched her hand gently, and rode back toward his ranch with a full heart. He did not feel lonely anymore. Something new had begun, a quiet understanding between two worlds, two hearts, two people who had found connection where none was expected. And far behind him, standing tall on a small hill, the chief's daughter watched until he disappeared from sight, already waiting for the day they would meet again.